好，徐欣。徐欣，听得见吗？徐欣？
我怎么看不见徐老师？
我刚看到他，他在左上角。
徐欣的脑袋在这儿呢。
哎，徐老师，
到中间来了。刚说你在左上角。
And Deputy Director General, Mr. Sun is also online.
Right, Professor Fu.
Hello, Mr. Sun. Thank you.
Professor Lihi.
我们开始了 So let's start. Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. 30 years ago, the diplomatic relation between Israel and China was established. During the past 3 decades, a good number of Chinese and Israeli scholars have been working on Jewish studies or Chinese studies and have attained great achievements. Today, we are gathering together online in order to commemorate and celebrate the 30th anniversary of the diplomatic and academic relations by retrospecting the past and prospecting tomorrow. Now, on behalf of the Center for Judaic and Interreligious Studies, Shandong University, SDU-TAU Joint Institute, and the Shandong-Israel Exchange Cooperation Research Center, I would like to express my heartiest thanks to all of you, the noble guests, and the distinguished scholars from Israel and China, for your tremendous support in the past, as well as your presence at the conference today. Now, let me briefly introduce the noble guests and speakers in today's forum. Ms. Irit Ben Abba Vitali, the Ambassador of Israel to China. Is the ambassador at present? Maybe not yet.
No, I'm here. I'm fully here.
Oh, so nice to meet you.
Hello, hi, Professor. Good to see you again.
Yeah, thank you for your attendance. Mr. Sun Yebao, Deputy Secretary General of the Foreign Affairs Office of Shandong Provincial People's Government. Please wave your hand. Sun主任。可能也是我们看不到啊。Professor Fan Liming, President of Shandong University, Professor Ariel Parat, the President of Fan Liming and the President Parat is the President of Tel Aviv University. Both of them will greeting us by video. Professor Aaron Shai, the former rector of Tel Aviv University. Hello, Aaron Shai. Professor Shai. Professor Yuri Shavich, co-head of SDU-TAU Joint Institute for Jewish and Israel Studies. Hello, Yuri.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I couldn't see you.
Here I am.
Hello, how are you?
Thank you.
Professor Pan Wang, Dean of the Center for Jewish Studies from the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences. Professor Pan. Professor Xu Xin, Director of Dana Guilford Glaser Institute of Jewish and Israel Studies, Nanjing University, Chairman of China Alliance of Jewish and Israel Studies. Professor Xu Xin, and Professor Xiao Xian, the former Vice President of Yunnan University. Professor Zhang Qianhong, Vice President of Zhengzhou University. Professor Zhang Ping from the Department of East Asian Studies at Tel Aviv University. He's also an affiliated chair professor of Shandong University.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, so haven't seen you for ages. Professor Arif Laur, Abraham Miller Chair in Chinese Studies from the Department of Asian Studies at Hebrew University, Jerusalem.
Hello.
Hello, hello. And Professor Qiao Guotiang, Director of Institute of Jewish Studies from Shanghai International Studies University. Professor Zhong Zhiqing from the Institute of Foreign Literature, China Academy of Social Sciences. Professor Fu Xiaowei, she's the head of the Center for Jewish and Israel Studies at Sichuan International Studies University. Professor Wang Yu, she's the Director of Israel and Jewish Cultural Studies, Beijing University. Professor Lei Yu from the Center for Israel Studies at Northwest University. Professor Hu Hao, he's the head of the Center for Israel Studies at Henan University.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm Fu Yude, the head of the Center for Judaic and Interreligious Studies of Shandong University, co-head of SDU-TAU Joint Institute, and head of Shandong-Israel Exchange Cooperation Research Center at Shandong University. I've also noticed a good number of domestic and overseas scholars and students are present in the forum. You are all warmly welcomed. Now it's the time for us to formally start the forum. First of all, let us welcome Ambassador Aviv Ben Abba Vitali to deliver the opening speech. Welcome.
Hello, Professor Fu.
Hello.
Mr. Sun Yebao, the DDG from, hello, how are you? Professor Fan Liming, the president of Shandong University, and Professor Ariel Porat, the president of Tel Aviv University, and all the distinguished guests, professors from all over China. I'm quite sure that I will get to meet you sometimes in the near future. But I'm very happy that I managed to get to Shandong University in December and meet all the colleagues there that are doing a marvelous job in trying to connect Israel and China. So Thank you for inviting me to say a few words in this SDU-TAU Joint Institute for Jewish and Israeli Studies. When I visited Shandong, we went up to I think it was the second floor, and we looked at the room with all the books, all the articles that were written already in the last 30 years of our full diplomatic relations. So I thank you all for keeping on studying this very important topic, because we believe that relations are not only political relations between countries, but definitely people-to-people relations. And our relations go back thousands of years. The connectivity between the Jewish people and the Chinese people went back to the Tang Dynasty. And since then, we definitely have scripts and historical facts that can prove this. And we're very proud to mention this whenever we speak about our bilateral relations. Unfortunately, we are celebrating 30 years in a very peculiar way. I wish we could have done this seminar physically and not online. All our activities this year are physical, online activities, unfortunately. We started this 30th anniversary with a very important high-level political meeting that took place on the day of the establishment of relations, the 4th of January, with the high-level meeting of the Joint Commission of Innovative Partnership between our countries. The Vice President Wang Qishan headed the Chinese side, and on our side it was alternate Prime Minister Mr. Yair Lapid, and we had 13 different ministries participating in this important meeting. But as I said before, people-to-people gatherings are not less important than political gatherings. And I'm very happy that we are meeting here this afternoon. The topics are very important, very interesting. And I wish you all a very successful afternoon. We enjoy good bilateral relations, as you know, with the ups and downs that we have had in the last years. It took us many years to establish relations with China. We were waiting for this since 1950, when we recognized the People's Republic of China. And since then, we fast forwarded quickly, and we saw a major development in our bilateral relations, not to mention the economic and trade relations that are skyrocketing. Last year, we had an interesting figure of $21 billion of bilateral trade, which would be a major challenge to maintain this level of bilateral trade in 2022 with all the problems we are facing, war in Ukraine, COVID in China, but definitely these kinds of collaborations between universities should be maintained. And I hope that very soon borders will be opened and professors can meet each other face to face, and students can meet each other, and the good relations existing between our universities can restart. So all the best, and I will tune to some of the deliberations this afternoon, but not to all of them, unfortunately. But I know that you are recording this session, so I'll be very happy to get the recording and listen to the full seminar. So good luck to all of you, and I hope, as I said before, to meet each and everyone physically, because you come from all parts of China. I saw the universities that you are representing, from Nanjing, Sichuan, Yunnan, Henan, Beijing, of course, and Shandong. So I greet you all for contributing to our bilateral relations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you for your greeting words. and also thank all of the Jewish and Israeli friends who have supported us in the past 30 years. And now, let's invite Deputy Secretary General of Shandong Foreign Affairs Office, Mr. Sun Yebao, to address remarks.
OK，尊敬的潘奇瑞大使、蒲瑞礼校长、范立明校长、费有德教授及各位专家，大家下午好。
Ambassador Ari Ben Abba, Professor
没开吧？开了，近一点，靠近一点。
President Ariel Porat, President Fan Liming, and also Professor Fu Youdong, all the attending experts and scholars.
非常荣幸啊，受邀参加今天下午的会议。在此呢，我谨代表山东省人民政府外事办公室，对本次会议的成功举办表示热烈的祝贺。
It is an honor to be invited to attend today's forum. Here, on behalf of the Shandong Provincial Foreign Affairs Office, I would like to express our warm congratulations on the successful holding of the forum.
正如习近平主席啊，在于和佐格总统在庆祝中伊建交30周年致贺电中指出的那样，中伊建交以来，两国人民友谊日益深化，双边关系取得长足发展。
As President Xi Jinping pointed out in his message of congratulations to President Isaac Herzog, celebrating the 30th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations of China and Israel. Since the establishment of diplomatic relations of our two countries, the friendship between the two peoples has been deepened, and our bilateral relations have achieved remarkable development.
两个古老民族的传统友谊不断焕发出新的光芒。
The traditional friendship between the two ancient nations has been revived.
30年来，两国政治互信不断增强，互利合作蓬勃发展，民心相通持续深化。
Over the past 30 years, political mutual trust between the two countries has been continuously enhanced. Mutual beneficial cooperations has flourished, and also the people-to-people bonds have been deepened.
山东呢是中国东部沿海的人口大省、文化大省、经济大省、农业大省。泰山在这里崛起，孔子在这里诞生，黄河在这里入海。
Shandong is an economic powerhouse with a large population, rich culture, and great agricultural strength. It is located on the eastern coast of China. And Mount Tai rises here, Confucius was born here, and the Yellow River flows into the sea in here.
山东和以色列的友好交往呢源远流长，各领域合作基础良好。目前双方地方政府间共建立了4对友诚和友好合作关系。在科技、农业、医药等领域开展了一系列的务实合作。
Shandong and Israel have a long history of friendly exchange and a solid foundation for cooperation in various fields. For now, 4 pairs of sister cities and friendly cooperative relations have been established between the local governments of the two sides, and we have been engaged in the collaborations in the fields of science and technology, agriculture, and medical care.
这个潘奇瑞大使也非常重视山东与以色列的友好交往。去年12月呢，大使阁下亲访山东，我曾全程陪同，双方举办了对话山东、山东以色列农业科技企业交流会。同时呢，大使来访期间呢，还为山东大学山东省与以色列交流合作研究中心揭牌，进一步推动了双方的务实合作。
Ambassador Ari Ben Abba highly values the collaborations between Shandong and Israel. In December last year, I also accompanied Ambassador during her visit to Shandong. We have co-organized the dialogue with Shandong, the Shandong-Israel Enterprise Seminars on agriculture, science, and technology, and the ambassador also unveiled the plaque for Shandong-Israel Exchange and Cooperation Research Center at Shandong University, which all of which further promoted the practical collaboration between Shandong and Israel.
山东愿以中以两国建交30周年为契机，推动双方务实合作取得新的进展，为中以两国务实合作贡献山东力量。
Shandong is willing to take the 30th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and Israel as an opportunity to promote new progress in our collaboration and contribute Shandong's share to China-Israel friendly exchange.
下一步呢，我们期待与以色列驻华使馆与大使阁下以及伊方各部门机构携手，推动我省更多领域与更多的城市与以色列呢建立友好合作关系，推动山东在以的朋友圈呢不断的扩大。
For the future, we look forward to working with the Israeli embassy and the ambassador and also the Israeli counterparts and jointly promote more cities in Shandong to establish friendly relations with Israeli cities, expand Shandong's friend circle in Israel.
同时呢，探讨建立山东与以色列科技企业精准对接的机制，举办系列产业对接交流会，加强双方在文化、艺术、青少年、高校、智库等领域的友好交流，促进民心相通。
We also would like to explore the possibility of setting up a precise matchmaking mechanism between Shandong and Israeli technology companies and hold a series of industrial cooperation meetings. On the other hand, we would like to promote friendly exchange between the two sides in the fields of culture and art, youth, universities, think tanks, etc., and strengthen our people-to-people bonds.
山东大学啊，是中国知名的百年学府，也是我的母校，历史悠久，学科齐全，实力雄厚，特色鲜明，是中国重点综合性大学。同时呢，又是中以7+7研究型大学联盟的成员高校。
Shandong has a history of more than 100. Shandong University has a history of 100 years, and I also once studied in Shandong University. It is a key comprehensive university in China with a strong science and technology strengths and distinctive characters. And also, Shandong University is a member of the China-Israel 7+7 Research Universities Alliance.
那么费有德教授啊，是国内著名的犹太与以色列研究专家，长期致力于犹太文明和以色列问题的研究，与以色列高校和科研机构开展了密切的学术交流与合作。
Professor Fu Youdong is a renowned expert in Jewish and Israeli studies in China. He has long been devoted to the study of Jewish civilization and Israeli issues and has carried out close academic exchange with the Israeli universities and research institutions.
希望犹太与以色列联合研究所继续开展科学研究和交流活动，助力山东与以色列在教育、文化、智库等领域的交流与合作。
Hope that the joint research for Jewish and Israeli studies hope that the Joint Institute for Jewish and Israel Studies will continue engaging in scientific research and exchange activities and facilitate the collaboration between Shandong and Israel in education, culture, and think tanks.
正如刚才啊，大使阁下在致辞中所说，我们期待疫情呢早日结束，期待疫情之后呢，与各位以色列的专家学者线下相聚，畅叙友谊。 预祝呢本次座谈会取得圆满成功，预祝各位专家、各位嘉宾、各位朋友身体健康，工作顺利，学术研究啊百尺竿头，更进一步。同时呢，也在这里呢给大家道歉，因为工作关系，请允许我呢今天呢只能用中文做以上的致辞，谢谢。
Just as mentioned by Ambassador in her speech, we all look forward to gathering with the Israeli experts and scholars when the epidemic is over to renew our friendship and also wish the forum a complete success and wish all the guests and friends good health and success in work. And I would like to explain that I have to deliver my speech in Chinese because of some work reasons. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Sun, for your wonderful greeting words. Now let's welcome President of Shandong University, Professor Fan Liming, and to give her welcoming address.
尊敬的潘奇瑞大使、Ariel Poirot 校长、孙业宝副主任、各位专家学者，大家好。今年是中以建交30周年，非常感谢大家参加山东大学犹太教与跨宗教研究中心组织的庆祝中以建交30周年中以学者论坛。首先，我仅代表山东大学，向参加此次会议的中以两国专家学者表示热烈的欢迎，并向长期以来关注和支持我校发展的各位朋友致以衷心的感谢。借着今天这样一个难得的机会，我先向各位简要介绍一下我校的基本情况。山东大学是一所历史悠久的百年学府，其主体是1901年创办的山东大学堂，是继京师大学堂之后，中国创办的第2所国立大学，也是中国第1所按章程办学的大学，被誉为中国近代高等教育的起源性大学。建校120多年来，山东大学秉承为天下储人才、为国家图富强的办学宗旨，践行学无止境、气有浩然的校训精神，追求真理，传创文化，引领未来，为国家和社会培养了60余万名各类人才，为国家和区域经济社会发展做出了积极贡献。山东大学学科门类齐全，学术实力雄厚，拥有深厚的人文社会科学研究传统。建校120年来，在人文学科领域几度创造辉煌，形成了自己的学科优势和特色，涌现出了一批享誉海内外的人文社科学者。学校向来重视发展人文社科学术研究，近年来出台一系列新政策，全方位加强对人文社科的支持，全面推动实现新时代背景下山东大学人文社会科学的新发展。犹太与以色列研究是山东大学人文社科领域的特色优势学科。近30年来，在傅有德教授的带领下，取得了广受学界好评的成绩。山东大学犹太教与跨宗教研究中心入选教育部人文社会科学重点研究基地，是目前我校4所教育部人文社科重点研究基地之一，形成了犹太哲学与宗教研究领域的特色和优势，同时兼及其他宗教和跨宗教研究，国内外学术影响力不断提升。作为学术研究的拓展与延伸，近年来，山东大学积极开展以色列研究，并在前期奠定的基础上，不断拓展和加强与以色列高校的交流与合作。2015年，中以7+7高校联盟成立，山东大学是其中的重要成员。2019年，在以中双方的共同努力下，山东大学特拉维夫大学 犹太与以色列联合研究所正式成立。该联合研究所为两校学者深度协作、强强联合提供了合作交流平台。联合研究所自成立以来，得到了双方学校的大力支持。2021年，我与潘奇瑞大使一起为新成立的山东省与以色列交流合作研究中心揭牌。该机构的成立将进一步发挥山东大学的以色列研究优势，更好地服务山东，推动和促进两国在政治、经济、科学、人文学术和高等教育等多领域的协同和互动。我衷心希望此次论坛能够以中以建交30周年为契机，深入总结中以学者在犹太、以色列研究方面所取得的成绩和经验，在“一带一路”倡议的框架下，加强中以学者与高校间的合作交流，为推进中国和犹太这两大古老文明之间的交流互鉴，为人类命运共同体的构建贡献学术力量。最后，衷心预祝会议圆满成功。谢谢大家。
Thank you, Professor Fan Liming. And now let's welcome President of Tel Aviv University, Professor Ariel Parat, to make a speech.
Dear colleagues, from Shandong University and Tel Aviv University. It is with great pleasure that I open this year's annual conference of the Joint Institute of Israel and Judaism Studies. This year has particular significance in the context of the 30th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between Israel and China. I believe that the academic ties between the two countries are an important part of the bilateral relationship and play a key role in strengthening people-to-people ties between our two nations. I'm delighted that the partnership between Shandong University and Tel Aviv University continues to thrive through the Joint Institute for Israel and Judaism Studies. The center builds upon the long history of cooperation between the Jewish and Chinese people, and I believe there is great importance in continuing this tradition and making efforts to learn more about each other so as to improve mutual understanding. Tel Aviv University sees the Joint Institute as an important element of TAU's deepening partnership with Chinese universities. We are particularly happy to cooperate with a prestigious university like Shandong University, one of China's best, with its strong tradition of excellent research on Jewish and Israeli history. I hope that over the next couple of years, we can build on the activities which have already taken place and expand the scope and impact of the Institute through more exchanges between faculty and students, joint publications, and other academic activities. I would like to congratulate everyone who has been involved in organizing this event and in promoting the ongoing cooperation between our two universities. I look forward to hopefully holding next year's conference in person. Wishing you all a successful conference.
Thank you, President. Thank you for your wonderful greeting speech. Now, the opening ceremony for the forum is over. All of the noble guests, I mean, the ambassador and the officials of the from Shandong province, may leave if you wish. Of course, you're also welcome to stay if you want to listen to the presentations. So now let us move on to the speaker's presentation. First speaker is Professor Pan Guang. Professor Pan Guang from Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences. And the title of his presentation is 74 Years of China-Israel Relations, Retrospect and Prospect. Welcome, Professor Pan Guang.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for organizing this significant conference. And Professor Fu asked me to give a comprehensive introduction. So I use the big topic is not only 30 years or 74 years. And 74 years basically could be divided into the four stages. Firstly, 1948, establishment of State Israel and founding People's Republic of China from 1948 to 1956. This is the first period. We call this tentative friendship, but also call this opportunity missed. Because Israel was the first country in the Middle East to recognize the People's Republic of China. The two countries almost reached agreement to establish in the diplomatic relations, even in early 1950. But opportunity missed first because Korea War, then because Bandung Conference, China established diplomatic relations with more and more Arabic countries. So I call this is tentative friendship. Second stage from 1956 to 1977, we call the long freezer period. But it's interesting. It's very interesting since the U.S. attitude towards China-Israel relations changed after President Nixon's visit to China in 1972. Also, Arab country changed, especially after President Sadat's visit to Jerusalem. So the situation changed. It's a very good condition for China-Israel relations. And the third stage, I call this restoration of friendship, 1978 to 1992. This period stage, we all work for the diplomatic relations. Fourth, starting from 1992, is a new area of China-Israel relations. Since the time is limited, so I focus on 1992 because I'm personally joining this process. Effects from Chinese side, the three groups work very hard for the preparing the diplomatic relations. First group is diplomats, especially led the Ambassador Yang Fuchang, is later Deputy Foreign Minister, and the group. Second group is media. Especially, I should mention Mr. Gao Qiufu. He was the director Xinhua News Agency.
Something wrong with the signal. I couldn't hear you.
Now they come
Yes.
back. Yeah, come back. So the media group, the Mr. Gao Qiufu, he is the first journalist to visit Israel. He got a visa from the Israeli embassy in Cairo. So this is a very, and supported by American Jews, very active to promote China-Israel relations, especially Jewish community in the United States, play very important role. So third group is academic group, including first group to visit Israel. First, academic group to visit Israel. 19th the diplomatic relations. At that time, we have to got
So the signal is also interrupted. Can you hear me? We couldn't hear you. We couldn't. I can see you, but no sound. No what? I can't listen to your voice. Can you continue, Professor Pan Wang? No, he's in Shanghai. Shanghai is still locked down. The signal is not strong enough. Hello.
now come back. Now come
Yes.
back.
Yeah.
So you can hear me. So last group.
Finally.
Yeah, last group is academic group. Many scholars. In fact, today several scholars also joined conference, like Professor Xiao Xian, Professor Xu Xing. I remember the first academic group to visit Israel in the December or in November 1991, just 3 months, because we lay the academic and cultural foundation for the diplomatic relations. I remember a very important visit to Israel. We met the other group in Minister Foreign Affairs. I still remember we visit Prime Minister Shamir, Foreign Minister Levy. Also, I should mention, and Moshe Yagan, David Matnai, and Ambassador Irit Bnaba was there, and Lush Kahanov was there. At that time, they were young girls. So we all work very hard for this. So finally, in the early 1992, the both countries established diplomatic relations. So became the last stage. I called it the new stage, new era of China-Israel relations. So in retrospect, I can only say a few words about this because I give a lecture for 2 or 3 hours about all these 4 stages, many interesting story. And now I just say a few words, prospect. Prospect, I'm sure in the future, China and Israel will develop the good relations rapidly and smoothly, especially on the innovation. Now in Shanghai, we have Israel, China, Israel, the innovation base, very successful, very successful. Now for the, just a few words about the program. We still have some program. Among the Chinese scholars, the key issue is whether US still have veto power on China-Israel relations. It's very interesting, very debating. And as group said, yes, US still have veto power. They always use the Falcon case, Falcon, the early warning aircraft, the case. They said that you can see China even already paid money, but the US said no. So everything is finished. But more and more people think, yes, US have influence on China-Israel relations, but it does not mean they have veto power. Then this group always use the case of Port of Haifa. Because I'm working for this, why we are very happy to see the Port Haifa now there. Very advanced, very successful, welcomed by Israeli people. In fact, US very strong oppose this. And they even said that if you ask Chinese build this Haifa port, the US warship cannot stop Haifa in the future. But I'm happy to see the article in Jerusalem Post said, oh, if China want to do something or want to do something like spy, they can rent apartment in Haifa. It's not necessary to build a port. So this is a very interesting article and welcomed by Chinese people. So I think basically US, of course, will have influence, very important influence on Israel-China relations, but I don't think this is really the veto power. Both China and Israel can find a way to promote our cooperation. So finally, I might conclude, I use old Chinese saying, is that a road with zigzags promised a bright future. In Chinese called 道路是曲折的，前途是光明的。Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Pan Wang, from your remark. We know, I think you have one good memory of the establishment of the two countries and a very interesting prospect of the relations between the two countries. Now, Yuri, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Yuda. And I have the pleasure to introduce, without further ado, Professor Aaron Shai. Ronnie Shai, who is the former rector of our university, Tel Aviv University, and the leading expert in Israel on modern Chinese history. So a lot of what Israelis actually know about modern China is from him. Professor Shai, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. I'm so glad to meet old friends and of course our ambassador, Erit, who is a good friend, Ben Abba, and Professor Fu Yode, not to mention, of course, Pang Wang, whom I met so many times in Shanghai. Good to see you. And of course, June, who used to come to Israel so often, and my friend Lihi Yariv and other friends here, whom I really appreciate their work. And my friend Zhang, who is professor here at the Tel Aviv University. As you know, I've been working on China, one of the first to work on China for the past 54 years. And I actually tried to follow everything that occurred since the early 1960s. Now, when we talk about Sino-Israeli relations, these were not initiated I think, 30 years ago in 1992, or even 73 or 74 years ago, when we actually recognized, when the government of Israel recognized China and was one of the very first countries in the world to recognize the People's Republic of China out of full belief in its ideology and in its leadership, as it was proclaimed on October 1st at Tiananmen. One actually needs to go, I think, back in history to the rise of two national movements, that of the Chinese, led by Dr. Sun Yat-sen, and that of the Jews, whose prophet and leader was Dr. Theodor Herzl. These two movements, and it's very important to remember that, rose like a phoenix from the ashes of humiliation and exploitation, and from anti-Semitism and anti-Chineseness to a great extent, and vicious pogroms at the very end of the 19th century. In fact, one cannot separate the historic year 1992 from earlier significant turning points. Studying the Chinese history and religiously following events and developments in China, it becomes quite evident that indeed old and new is the precise term to describe not only new China, but also new Israel. These two entities represent two ancient civilizations, as we all know, and the amazing story behind their reemergence in modern history is the fact that they have existed continuously over millennia. These two cradles of rich civilizations are geographically situated at opposite ends of the Asian continent. China claims, and rightly so, an unbroken history of developments on its own land, and Israel experienced what we can describe as a virtual form of continuity, a ceaseless striving over millennia of exile to return once again to its ancient homeland. The questions to be asked, I think, are really what made it possible for these two nations to develop reciprocal relations given the physical distance and the many vast differences between them, and what kind of relations do Israel and China have today. And I think our forum is very important in this context. I shall not detail the story of Sino-Israeli relations that my friends, and of course my good friends Bang Wang has mentioned, and the colleagues here know so very well. But I would merely like to underline the ups and downs and the fluctuation, the vicissitudes in these relations. We know that Israel was one of the first countries to recognize the PRC under the leadership of the Communist Party, but we are also acquainted with the difficulties mentioned, let's say, during the Korean War, the Bandung Conference, and in fact the wars, the crisis in 1956, 1967, and 1973. Those were difficult years for our mutual relations. However, we also appreciate the lively cooperation we have managed to see in many productive fields, such as agriculture, tourism, even prior to the establishment of formal relations. And we have to remember that relations existed even before 1992. After relations, formal relations were established 30 years ago, this was a great success, of course. And after embassies were opened in both Beijing and Tel Aviv, trade and economic connections broadened, first at a moderate pace and then with increasing momentum. Israel exported technologies to China in the fields such as high-tech, chemical industries, communications, agriculture, medical equipment, and so on and so forth. The volume of trade between the two states gradually swelled, and China became one of Israel's leading trade partners. Although this trade was affected by the economic crisis of 2008, we see that a year later, in 2009, it declined only 17%, but later on, we see rapid recovery, which began, and in fact, last year, in 2021, the growth trend continued for trade volume, which stood at close to $15 billion. Israeli exports to China were valued at 1/3, while imports from China rose to close to 10 billion, and the proportion really is 1/3 to 2/3, and this indicates, of course, China's great success as far as industry and production is concerned. Now, still, as far as Israel is concerned, we have to strive for better because exports to China are highly focused only in 4 areas, and we need actually to expand it to more than electronic components, chemicals, and minerals. And I hope that in the future, we shall see a further growth as far as our trade is concerned. As far as academic relations, and I'm very glad to say that I took some part in that between the 2 countries, it is sufficient if we mention the 4 departments of East Asian studies concentrating on Chinese studies and language, which exist in 4 Israeli universities, and of course in others, but I'm talking about the main universities, and the 2 flourishing Confucius institutes, which are so active here. And even though there are difficulties with the Confucius Institute throughout the world, as far as Israel is concerned, we see these 2 institutes actually flourishing and doing a great deal in expanding Chinese culture, language, etc. Also, I would like to mention that tens of students go regularly to China to study there, and we have signed so many memoranda with academic institutions and in China, not to mention, of course, the activity of the Technion, our very important university in China, and the branch it actually established there. Sino-Israeli relations have had and still have international significance, especially with regard to Israel's strategic and military role in the Middle East equation. Indeed, it is fantastic to see how the world covers Israeli and Chinese relations, because these relations are much more important than the actual 2 nations relations, and it has really, they have a wider repercussions throughout the world. China is interested in becoming a full partner in the peace process here. Also, China seems to expect Israel to become one of China's major suppliers of advanced technologies, share its know-how and success in the realm of innovation, and perhaps even renewed cooperation regarding security and equipment, etc. But to tell you the truth, what I see is that China is advanced to such an extent that it needs less and less the importation of technology from outside. And what I predict is that in the near future, we shall see actually China exporting technologies, and the world, Israel included, learning from China. It is in this context that Israel-China Innovation Conference, which was mentioned and was opened in 2018, should be mentioned, as it signals a new era in Israel-China relations. Now, I think that, and it was mentioned, but of course it needs further discussion, that these bilateral relations discussed here today are an integral part of a sophisticated, complex triangle which Washington plays a role. And Professor Pang Guang mentioned this, and of course we can expand much more because the US is, fortunately or unfortunately, part of these bilateral relations, and we don't have to conceal this. This is a major fact. Looking at these relations in the past 3 or 4 years from a trade investments angle, one detects interesting data. For example, China has invested in more than 25 different sectors in Israel. This is the clock that my grandfather inherited to me, and this is the only thing I have. So you hear the clock, and now it's 12 in Israel, 12 o'clock in Israel. It's an ancient clock which was built in the year 1900. For example, China has invested more than 25 different sectors in Israel. This includes, of course, science and technology, food security, academia, energy, infrastructure, agriculture, industry, technology, venture capitals, etc., biomedicine, whatever you want. And this is something that the Israelis are really overwhelmed when they see how important China today is for Israeli economy. Tens of Chinese officials and non-official organs and firms have been involved in that impressive project of getting deeply involved in Israel. It is estimated that tens of billions of dollars are involved here. And I also want to mention that before the COVID crisis, in fact, about 150 Chinese came as tourists, 150,000, of course, came to Israel. All what I said can be seen not only as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, which was mentioned, but also as a step in the initiation of China's 14th five-year plan to run through 2025. And President Xi Jinping, as Thomas Friedman has observed, doubled down on his government's investment in what has been termed innovation-driven development. And this is really the most important thing as far as the two countries are concerned. As for reciprocal relations, I believe that the esteem and the admiration with which Chinese regard the Jews, the Jewish thought and philosophy, and of course, Israel and its people, and their achievements in many walks of life, such as science and technology, is the main reason for Beijing's growing interest in close relations with today's Israel. As far as Israel is concerned, it appears that Israelis, especially in recent years, have discovered emerging China and want to explore its unprecedented success and achievements. Now we want to imitate and to learn from China, and I think there is a lot to be learned. Indeed, Israel can learn and must learn and have stronger contacts with China. Recently, China's One Belt, One Road initiative stimulated interest in Israel. Israel, though not formal partner to the project, can undoubtedly play an important role in that strategic far-reaching plan. Situated in a unique geostrategic region with its vast achievements in the realm of high-tech, cyber technology, innovation, and so on, Israel would be instrumental in promoting that project. A planned railway between the Red Sea, Eilat, and central Israel, Ashdod, what we call the Red Med line, could serve, and I'm sure China will be involved in that, could serve as a continental bridge for the transshipment of Asian, mainly Chinese goods and materials from the Far East to Europe and vice versa. However, I'm going to complete. I'm finishing. I
don't want to be rude, but because you mentioned your grandfather's clock.
Yes. So you have to detect this. Okay. Now, This partnership is based on protecting and respecting concerns of both parties. We also expect, and this is important, and I want to be frank here, we also expect to criticize each other whenever necessary. So we want to hear your criticism as far as Israel is concerned. And sometimes we even have some things to say to China and to our Chinese friends when there are some things to say, because we have to be really frank. It is to be hoped that the next decades will further enhance Sino-Israeli relations that will undoubtedly benefit the inhabitants of these two countries. Thank you very much, all of you. I really appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shai. Next speaker is Professor Xu Xin, and he's from Nanjing University, a leading scholar of Jewish and Israeli studies in China. His presentation is entitled Israel Studies in China, How and What. Welcome, Professor Xu Xin.
Thank you, Professor Fu. Good afternoon, dear friends and colleagues. I'm extremely glad to gather with you in this forum to celebrate the 30th anniversary between China and Israel's formal relationship. I'd like also thank to Shandong University and Tel Aviv University Joint Institute for Jewish and Israel Studies to organize this event. This is a very important and interesting time. And when we talk about relationship between China and Israel, Professor Fu and I finally come to a topic I'm going to address now, is Israel Studies in China, How and What. It was trying to talk about how did Israel Studies start in China and what have we achieved. This is but the time is very much limited, but I try to be short and to review what has been done and what's the reason behind it. As many speakers spoke ahead of me, documented material shows that in times there were exist facts. Some Jews came to China. We could say this is the first time the Chinese had encounter with Jewish people. The history of Kaifeng Jewish community in China since 11th century probably tells us there is presence in Chinese society. But having said that, we have no way to show Chinese really have great knowledge about Jews or Jewish people. They are not aware of this. For instance, even Kaifeng Jews, the name, we call them Tiao Jingjiao, the sects that pluck out sinews to show Chinese had very little knowledge. As a matter of fact, when Chinese opened its door by Western power in 1840, before that, China we could consider more or less a closed society. Though there were other people, journalists or tourists or merchants came to China through Silk Road, whatever takes them, and the Chinese know very, very little about it. And only since 1840, Chinese door opened for the first time by Western power, and China started to learn about Jews. And then we could say, to some extent, Judaic studies appeared in Chinese history as because encounter of Chinese culture with Western culture. Sometimes I believe it is in the process of introduce Occidental studies to Chinese, which finally leads to the inevitable contact with Judaism or Jewish studies, because Chinese people or intellectuals understand like Judaism, after all, is one of the two major sources of Western civilization. Information about Jews and Judaism start to come to China at the end of 19th century and the beginning of 20th century. And that period of time, if we review them, we could find out before 1930s, if I could use that time, shows Judaic studies first appeared in China. There were many subjects were being touched by Chinese scholars. For instance, the Jewish diaspora in China, Yiddish literature, Judaism, Zionism, and the Jewish history. Though the knowledge of these topics is very limited, but nobody can deny the finding of Jewish studies in China then had laid the foundation for Chinese to be aware of Israel when it was established. Of course, before the modern state of Israel established, there's no way to talk about the Israel studies. So only after this make it possible for us to discuss this. As just now Professor mentioned, there were Jewish studies in China, and then with history, we trace back to the 20th century. There was a lot of contact started, but actually a serious study of including Jewish studies, not alone or later alone Israel studies, were really carried very deeply. Very much because no formal relationship between China and Israel lead to the very abstract consequences. Chinese knowledge of Israel remains very limited and never went beyond abstract and superficial. It was always more negative than positive at the time. But however, it is very important Chinese realize the contribution of Judaism or Jewish tradition or Judaism to the world civilizations. Because of this, when China determined to reopen its door in 1978 forward, and then China started to pay much attention to Judaism, Jewish studies. So Jewish studies were Israel study actually, if we could consider it, is or was a part of Jewish studies to begin with. For instance, when we teach Jewish culture, Jewish courses at the universities, we always include Israel study, part of Israel. We have to tell our students what Israel means and what Israel is, for instance. So this is the essential part of the Jewish studies. But Israel study as a separate subject was something happened after China-Israel established diplomatic relations. Of course, one of the things we need to mention is in 1985, Peking University started to introduce a course of modern Hebrew language. This is, though, only focus on language teaching, but it is very important. Today, many Chinese scholars who are in the field of Israel study actually were students of that program. You see, their interest in Israel studies because through the learning of modern Hebrew language. What we could summarize the Israel studies once they started in the late 1980s. First of all, is the establishment of the academic institute. research institutes was established become very, very important. Just like Professor Pan Guang just mentioned, in Shanghai in 1987 to 1988, they established the Shanghai Judaic Studies Association. And Nanjing, we established a Judaic Studies Association in 1989. And also in Shandong University established a Center for Jewish Philosophy Studies or Jewish Studies in 1994, all become very important. Without those institutions, we cannot imagine the study of Israel subject could go this far so far. Secondly, its important things was publication of books and academic articles. There were many books or articles published in Chinese which greatly promote the study of Israel subjects. Chinese knowledge about modern Israel was basically come from those publications, because those who are able to visit Israel, a small number of people. To mention this visit to Israel, I personally believe that a visit to Israel become very, very important. Actually, my first visit to Israel was in 1988, and I met Professor Aaron Shah at Tel Aviv University in his class when he teaches Chinese history. See, that was 35 years ago. It is very important. Later on, I wrote an article about my visit to Israel. I claim that my journey to Jewish studies or Israel studies was started from there. And also, Professor Xiao Xian visited to Israel in 1989, also played an important role. As we all know, Professor Xiao played an important role in introducing Jewish studies, and his books about Israel or Jewish cultures almost read by everyone who involved in Jewish studies at that time. And there were many other publications, books, deeply promoted to this. Of course, today we could say some journals like Professor Fu's Institute published in 2002 the Journal of Jewish Studies, which every year they have a book published and greatly promoted. In recently, if we recall, Shandong University, headed by Professor Zhang Xianghong, published the Blue Books, the annual report on Israel national development. Could we imagine, like 20 years ago or 30 years ago, Chinese could write a book like that to report what's happening in Israel to Chinese? Then only after those years' work make it possible. Of course, the Israel studies developed in China has a lot to do with college education program. The courses were taught at various universities in China played an important role to train like younger generation. And now we have program for undergraduate, have program for MS students, for PhD students. You see, most people who teach now at the various Chinese universities basically were trained by those programs at various universities. So make it possible to do this. And also, I believe the achievement or with Israel studies was international conferences held in China. If we could recall, I believe Professor Pan Guang and I were both invited to attend a conference we called International Conference of Chinese and Jewish culture. It's actually when they prepare for that conference, China, Israel had not established diplomatic relations. The purpose to hold that international symposium, as they said later, was to lay the foundation for the better relationship. But sometimes situation develop much faster than people could imagine. So before that conference was held in Beijing, and China, Israel established diplomatic relations in January in 1992. But that conference was held in April, but plan was almost a year ahead. So this is very important. At that time, I believe Tel Aviv University played an important role because the head of Jewish delegation was headed by Yoram Dinkstein. Within that delegation, we have a former president of Israel, Lavon. Mr. Lavon was there, and also many distinguished scholars. And attended that Chinese scholars were the top Chinese scholars on philosophy, on history, on social sciences. But that's the first time they exchange programs. And also in 1996, Nanjing University and Tel Aviv University again and joint hold the first international symposium of Jewish studies in China. And a big delegation, a majority of members who come from Tel Aviv University to China. Professor Yoram Dinkstein still played important role. And today we have this joint meeting by Shandong University and Tel Aviv University to establish a joint institution for Jewish studies. This is a way of continuation. Of course, there were many other things happened, but today we say the Chinese knowledge through the Israel studies becomes much deeper. And as I mentioned, a lot of books and then articles or conferences were held. Without deepening of Israel studies, we cannot do this. So for this reason, I personally believe it is very important to have a direct contact between scholars from China and Israel, direct contacts to further promote the study of Israel subjects among Chinese. And that's why I believe this conference symposium will play important role. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Xu Xin. And the next speaker is Professor Xiao Xian from Yunnan University. And his presentation is about the establishment of Sino-Israel diplomatic relations. Welcome, Professor Xiao Xian.
Okay. Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank Shandong University and my old friend, Professor Fu Youdao, for inviting me to this forum to commemorate the 30 years of diplomatic relations between China and Israel. And I'm very glad to see some old friend here. And I would be happy to take this opportunity to share my own experience as a witness to the establishment of diplomatic relations between our two countries 30 years ago. My first visit to Israel took place in 1989, 3 years before the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and Israel. And at that time, I was studying at Middle East Center at Durham University, UK. There, I got to know a PhD student from Israel, whose name was Anat Lapidot. When she heard that I was doing Middle East study in China, but had never been to the Middle East. Then she voluntarily tried to find opportunity for me to visit Israel. Soon after, I received a letter from Professor Itamar Rabinovich, then the director of the Dayan Center at Tel Aviv University, inviting me to visit Israel and would bear the expenses during my stay there. However, as a Chinese government-sponsored scholar, it was not easy or even dangerous to visit Israel at that time, because China and Israel had no diplomatic relations, and Israel was still a sort of enemy to China, and was often bitterly criticized in Chinese media. Then I consulted the Chinese embassy in London, which again contacted the Chinese Foreign Ministry in Beijing. And finally, they gave me the green light and agreed that I could visit Israel as a private scholar, or in other words, in my personal capacity. So in July 1989, I went to Israel with my Chinese government business passport with a separate visa from the Israeli embassy in London. Later on, I learned that I was the first scholar from China mainland to visit Israel, although some Chinese scholars came to Israel before. They were either from Hong Kong, Taiwan, or from the United States. And I was the only one from the mainland. And at this time, I stayed in Israel for 2 weeks by the arrangement of Professor Rabinovich. I met some Israeli colleagues, gave 2 public lectures at the Tel Aviv University and Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and I visited many places like Western Wall, Yad Vashem, Museum of Jewish Diaspora, and joined a Shabbat dinner with the Jewish family, and spent a whole day in a kibbutz, etc., etc. It was after this trip that I fell in love with this country. And in the next 30 years, I spent a lot of time in studying this country and doing a lot of things to promote the understanding between China and Israel, between Chinese people and Israeli people. And after this visit, I wrote a report to the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs about my trip and about my own impression of this country. And I also gave a lecture to the Institute of Western Asia and African Studies of Chinese Academy of Social Sciences about this visit when I came back to China later that year. It was well known that in the year of 1990, China and Israel had set up liaison offices, respectively in Tel Aviv and in Beijing, under the name of Chinese Travel Agency and the Israeli Academy of Science and Humanities. I visited the Israeli liaison office a couple of times and developed very good relations with the personnel of it. In November 1991, I went to Israel again with a 3-month fellowship offered by Truman Institute in Hebrew University. When I was in Jerusalem, it was reported that a delegation of the Chinese Foreign Ministry had secretly arrived to discuss the matter of established diplomatic relations. When China and Israel actually signed the agreement of the diplomatic relations in Beijing in January 1991, I was still in Israel as a visiting scholar at the Truman Institute. I remembered that many colleagues of the Truman Institute came to my office and say congratulations to me. And also, all of a sudden, I became the interview topic by many Israeli media. And in those days, I was deeply touched by the enthusiasm of the Israeli people to China. And in the last 30 years, I had been to Israel many, many times, from as short as 3 days for participating a conference to as long as several months as a visiting professor at a certain university. In 1984, I even spent 4 months in a Hebrew language school, Ulpan Akiva at Netanya, to learn Hebrew, and finally obtained a certificate of A level of Hebrew language. My last visit to Israel was in 2014, when I and my wife stayed in Stebokel campus of Ben Gurion University as a visiting professor for 1 month. During my visits, my stays in Israel, I've made many Israeli friends and traveled to almost everywhere in this country. And I even had the honor of meeting 3 former prime ministers of Israel, Yitzhak Shamir, Yitzhak Rabin, and Shimon Peres. One of the important work and worst work I had done over these 30 years is to promote mutual understanding between China and Israel. In Israel, I give lectures on such topics as China's reform and opening up, the foreign policy of China, religions of China, Middle East studies in China, etc. In China, I taught Middle East and Israel in universities, wrote books and articles about Israel and about Jewish people. As early as 1992, when our 2 countries just formed diplomatic relations, I and my colleague published a book, the first book in China about Israel. The title is Israel, a Mysterious Country, which became one of the best sellers of that year and reprinted many times by the publisher. In these years, I wrote and translate more than a dozen books on Israel, on Jewish people. Some are more academic, some are just for general interest. But I believe all of them have contributed to the understanding and the friendship of Chinese people towards Israel and the Jewish people. 30 years is a long time in a person's life. When I first went to Israel, I was still a young man in my 30s, but now I'm not far from 70 years old. But 30 years is not a long period in the history of Chinese and Jewish nations, and also it's a short period in the relation between our 2 countries. So we should still work hard to help this relation grow better and longer. Toda rabba.
Thank you, Professor Xiaoxian. Next speaker is Professor Zhang Jianhong, and her presentation is about reflections on the history of Sino-Israel relations. Professor Zhang Jianhong, please.
Okay, Professor Fu, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm more than happy today to meet so many old friends here. I'm very honored today to share with everyone here how I feel for the history of Sino-Israel relations. In the past 30 years, I'm not only a witness of Sino-Israel relations, but also a participant. I was quite fortunate to conduct postdoctoral research at both Bar-Ilan University and Hebrew University. Today, I want to share with you two things that happened to me during my study at Bar-Ilan University. That was the year of 2000 and 2001. The first thing is my meeting with Meso-Court. After the establishment of Sino-Israel relations, Bar-Ilan once had the largest number of Chinese students in Israel, thanks to the 100 postdoctoral program of Barbara Court. I came to Bar-Ilan University at the peak of this program, when there were more than 30 Chinese postdoctoral students studying in the university. One day, we received a notice from the university and the Chinese embassy. They told us the sponsor of this program, Meso-Court, would visit Bar-Ilan, so we had a short meeting with him and his wife. During the meeting, the president of Bar-Ilan University recounted the story of how this program came into being. He said, one day, a gentleman came into his office, telling him he wanted to set up a scholarship. So the president asked him how many students he wanted to sponsor, 10 or 20? And the gentleman answered, no, 100, and only 4 Chinese students. The president commented later that this was a very special and very unforgettable scholarship in his memory. Then it was Meso-Court's turn to address us. He said emotionally, my children, I'm so glad to meet you today. Israel is my country, and China is also my country. Why he mentioned this because his family once lived in Shanghai as refugees during World War II. He said, the purpose for me to establish the scholarship is in the hope that these two countries could become true friends. I'm old and my power is limited, but I hope you, young people, could become ambassadors of China-Israel relations and pass on this friendship. I was so touched by Mr. Court's words at that time. He was so affectionate, with so much love and sincerity in his eyes, that I suddenly realized that I came to Israel despite so many difficulties and being far away from my family, my little boy, not only for studying Jewish history and culture, but with more important meanings. That's the first time I had realized that I'm endowed with an important mission, being a cultural ambassador between China and Israel. During my study at Bar-Ilan University, another thing moved me a lot. Every Wednesday afternoon, I would go to Habaziu Street of Tel Aviv to attend the activity of the Association of Former Residents of China in Israel. This is a congregation of old people who once lived in China. Its chairman was Teddy Kaufman, and they met once a week. You know, 20 years ago, buses in Israel were quite slow and very bumpy. It took me 1.5 hours from where I lived to the association. The problem is I had very heavy car sickness and suffered a lot from every round trip. But I kept visiting them every week. Anyhow, this is a group of old people living in memory. Their meeting was quite simple, free conversation with an easy fast food. But China was their unchangeable topic. They shared with me their life stories in China and showed me their old pictures in China again and again. If there were Chinese people visiting them, that would be a major event. Every year, the biggest event of the association was to award scholarships to young people, both Israeli youth and Chinese students. The purpose was to make the young people remember the history of Chinese Jews. For now, most of them have passed away, but their faces, their voices, and their feelings for China crossed my mind every now and then. Today, I also want to take this opportunity to thank a special person, Mr. Gerald Gotel from London Jewish Cultural Center. I believe most Chinese scholars online today know him well. In the nearly 20 years since I met him acquaintance, Jerry kept coming to Henan University and giving lectures to our students. He kept telling our students, if you want to study Israeli history, you need to feel Israel in person. In the past years, he made great efforts to seek opportunity for our teachers and students to study in Israel. A few hours before he passed away in October 2017, he sent me his last email, explaining to me that he couldn't go far away because of his heart problem. He was sorry that he couldn't meet our students who would study in Yad Vashem and Tel Aviv airport. He was so sorry that he was unable to accompany his dear students to feel Jerusalem and Israel. Finally, I want to say the 30 years relationship between China and Israel is not only a relationship between two countries, but also a relationship shaped by ordinary people with their feelings, efforts, dedications, and their marvelous personal stories. Long live Sino-Israel relationship. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zhang Qianhuang. Yuri, please.
Thank you. Thank you for, so far we have remarkable presentations, and some of them include also very emotional and personal stories that it is important to hear. So thank you very much for that. Our next speaker is Dr. Lee Yariv Laor from the Hebrew University. Do we see you?
I don't know, you see me
Yes,
or not?
perfectly. So I'm very happy that we meet and that I have the opportunity to introduce you, Dr. Laor.
Can you see me?
Yes, as if you are present in the room, the virtual room. And I will just mention that you specialize in Chinese linguistics, but also in translations of the Bible, of the good book to Chinese, and you will obviously share this with us. And I very gently and kindly wish to remind you and all the speakers that will follow that you have around 10 minutes. So it's very important that you abide by these time restrictions. The floor is all yours.
And can you see the presentation, because I don't know.
No, we only see you now.
Oh,
Yeah.
That's not good. That's not good. How do I make it?
How do you fix it,
How
Carl?
do I make the presentation? I have a presentation.
Go to the share screen button on the
Share
bottom.
screen.
Yeah, on the
Share
bottom.
Screen.
Yeah, share
Can
screen.
you help me with that?
It's down. It's like
on the
you look-
bottom.
it's on the bottom.
It's okay. Now?
Click on it, and then go to click
on
on
the
your PowerPoint and double click on the PowerPoint and click the blue button share.
Double click on the PowerPoint and
The blue button on the right is share.
Share. Now click share.
Now click share.
does it okay? No?
No.
No. Did you click the share?
Yeah.
אז זה כנראה לא עובד. את יכולה בלי המצגת?
No, oh, you cannot start? What is it? Oh my goodness. Can you see it now?
No.
No, you see, and they call us the high-tech nation.
Oh my goodness.
1 second.
Let me see something. It will take less than 10 minutes, but let's try to help me. I click the share. It says you cannot start screen share while other participants
Okay,
are
click.
sharing.
Yes.
Why?
Just a second, Lee. Just a second.
All right.
Okay. Okay, now try.
לי, תנסי בבקשה.
Yeah. Okay, share. No, it says other participant is sharing.
好像显示是肖老师的屏幕共享。
Your viewing shows.
肖老师要退出来，肖老师要退出共享。
对。
肖老师要退出来，然后那边才可以。
是的。
肖老师，肖老师，
你退出来，你的屏幕共享了，你退一下。
开始。
肖老师。
Okay. Okay.
肖老师。
Now you see it?
No. Okay. One second.
My goodness.
רגע.
Maybe.
You see, look at my screen. Do you see the share? Share button?
Just a moment, share button.
On the bottom of your screen. In the middle.
Open your file.
Yeah, I did it.
And open your file.
PPT. You open it now. You should be able to see you. We see your screen of your television, or your land or laptop or desktop. We see your screen.
Yeah, open.
You see me now?
No. Lee, if you cannot, Lee, wait. If you cannot manage without it, may I suggest you that we move on to the next speaker, and in the meantime, we'll try to solve.
All right, please move on, and please contact me.
Yes.
Or
okay.
Somebody.
So the next speaker.
Sorry.
Professor Yuda, you.
Yes, it's your turn.
Oh, it's still us. Great. So I have a great pleasure in introducing Professor Yan Ping. Is of Tel Aviv University and a former scholar of Hebrew literature, Chinese literature, and Jewish Confucian cultural encounters. So the floor is all yours, Professor Ping.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for organizing this conference, and thank you for inviting me to give the speech. I'll talk a little bit other than the subject I gave before, because I saw it's only 10 minutes, and I saw the subject of the whole conference is about 30 years of the relations between China and Israel. So what I'm going to talk is more about my personal experience and more about the current relationship between China and Israel. I arrived at Israel in 1993. That was 1 year after establishment of the diplomatic relations between China and Israel. And so I stayed here. By this year, it's 29 years. Yeah, that's 29 years. And look back at this 29 years of my life in Israel, and I would like to say that I was involved in many activities, and I dedicated a large part of my life to promote the understanding between our two cultures. I like very much to congratulate ourselves, the Chinese and Jewish people, for the progress in economic, cultural, and academic relations that we have made in these 30 years. I used to be very optimistic on these relations, and I gave several speeches about the relation in recent years. I used to summarize my speech by saying that the mutual understanding between our two nations that we have reached in these 30 years is more than we have achieved in 2,000 years before 1992. But in these days, when I think about what I'm going to say here, I found myself couldn't think about anything but the setbacks, the failures that we suffered in these 30 years. I'm talking about not about the personal setbacks, it's about the setbacks with historical significance and the setbacks that I personally experienced. I believe that while we congratulate ourselves for what we have achieved and hope for a fruitful and brilliant future, it is also important to talk about the lessons that we can learn from the failure. The first setback was the incident of the Falcon cell, which Professor Pan Guang mentioned before. I was personally involved, and I saw the enthusiasm and the willingness from both sides to make the deal successful. That was a time when Chinese wanted to buy and the Israelis were eager to sell. The atmosphere in the highest level meeting were very friendly, and they were celebrating even before the deal was done. And one day, I got a phone call from a Washington Post reporter who wanted an interview with me on the sale. So I told her that she should find somebody.
די גרוע, מה לעשות? רגע, אני...
Bihi.
She's now on mute, Professor. You can continue.
Okay. So the reporter called me. She's a reporter of Washington Post and called me. She wanted an interview about this sale. And so I told her that she should find someone in Washington to interview. As after all, the decision on the deal is not made in Beijing or in Jerusalem. Actually, it should be made in Washington. And this is what happened later. The Americans disagreed, the deal was canceled, and the Sino-Israeli relations suffered for quite a long time. The second setback is the rejection of Dr. Shalom Wau's report on developing relations between Chinese and Jewish nations by the Jewish People Policy Institute. And many of you sitting here today were involved in producing this report. This is a very important report. If we talk about the Sino-Israel relationship or Sino-Jewish relationship, we cannot ignore this report. And I was present at the meeting that made this decision. If they accept this as a policy or they reject it. And unfortunately, the decision was to turn it down. And I sat in this meeting. I argued, and I also heard the argument from the scholars who are against this report. And they were worried about a potential conflict between China and America will put Israel in a dilemma. That was 2007. Back then, I thought that they were worried too much because China-America relationship was in great term, and it was a very good relationship, and they call each other partners. But today, when we look back, I can say that they had their point. They had the point, yeah. And since they were the majority, and then so eventually the report was rejected, and that was the second setback. What I want to say here from these two setbacks, what we can learn from these two setbacks, and what we should do. The first thing I want to say is that the Sino-Israel relationship do not solely depend on the willingness and efforts of Chinese and Israeli people. We are not living in a vacuum. We cannot ignore the decisive role of America in this relationship. Anyone who truly want to promote Sino-Israel relations would also want to promote Sino-America and Israel-America relations. The effort of bringing China and America closer is almost as important as bringing China and Israel closer. This is the first thing. We have to think about others. When we think about the relationship between our two countries, we have to think about the others. And first of all, we have to think about America. The second thing is that what we have learned in the past, and especially in the past several years, is that history can move forward and can also move backward. So does the relationship. We make our efforts for the best, we hope for the best, but we also need to be prepared for bad days. And frankly speaking, I don't want to say this today here because it's supposed to be a good day. But I have to say this. I'm less optimistic than I was 2 years ago. From my point of view, I start to see worrying signs in this relationship. While we made great achievements in these 30 years, of course, yes, but I saw worrying signs. I don't want to talk in detail today, but we have to be prepared. And the third point I want to say, how do we prepare for this? How do we prepare for bad days? In my opinion, there are two levels of relations. There are relations in reality. I call it a realistic relations. Yeah, you build an institute, and you build a joint venture. Yeah, you build a port in another country. These are the relations in reality. These are realistic relations. And there is also another level of relations. I call it spiritual relations, mutual cultural understanding, yeah, the learning of the history and the tradition of each other, and I call this spiritual relations. While realistic relations make the progress in reality, spiritual relations provide a more solid and endurable foundation for the relation. Spiritual relation can be achieved by conducting inter-traditional dialogue between our two people. Yeah, the dialogue between Confucianism and Judaism, between Taoism and Judaism, the Sino-Israel relationship developed in the past 30 years. We should never forget, in the circumstances of globalization of the whole world. But today we entered into a new age, and I don't want to call it age of war and conflicts, but as I understand, it's not far away from that.
Professor, I'm afraid our time is beyond
last
up.
Last sentence.
So, last sentence.
In the current age of war and conflict, I still have confidence in dialogue, and I believe that this should be our focus for the next 5 or 10 years, while we cannot do many things in reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. An excellent presentation. I suggest Lee is still struggling with her computer, somewhat discrediting our reputation as startup nation. So I suggest we move on to the next speaker, Professor Yude, and then we can get back to Lee.
Okay. Next speaker is Professor Dong Qing from the China Academy of Social Sciences. And her presentation is entitled Translating Israeli Literature into Chinese. Welcome, Professor Dong Qing.
Okay. So, can you hear me? And can you
Yes.
see my PPT? Okay. So, I will start from the very beginning. Okay. PPT. Okay. Dear teachers, friends, and colleagues and students, thanks Professor Fu for organizing this significant event. It is my great pleasure and honor to be invited here to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and Israel. Actually, 27 years ago, can you see the PPT? Okay.
No, I can't.
Okay,
No
now you can. Now,
No PPT.
No PPT, so it's okay. I will talk because I would like to share some beautiful pictures with you. 27 years ago, in 1995, I was chosen by Professor Aaron Shai and got a chance to be a visiting scholar at Tel Aviv University, where I stayed for 2 years and studied my career in the field of Hebrew literature and studied Hebrew language from Kita Aleph to Vav. At the meantime, I also studied Jewish history and culture. I met with many great Hebrew writers such as Amos Oz, Aleph Beit Yeshua, David Grossman, Yehuda Amihai, and so on. Several years later, I studied modern Hebrew literature for more than 4 years at BGU and got my PhD there under the supervision of Professor Igor Schwartz and Professor Andrew Plax. Now I would like to share some translations with all the participants here. Translation indeed played a very important basic role for Chinese to get in touch with and to accept contemporary Israeli literature. Jewish literature was firstly introduced to China 100 years ago during the May 1st period, but only after the establishment of the diplomatic relationship between two countries did we translate Israeli translation into Chinese in a large scale. According to statistics, there are about 160 Israeli literary books translated into Chinese, but comparing to English and American literature and even Arabic literature in China, this number is really very, very small. Up to now, the most recognized and influential Israeli writer in China is still Amos Oz. I began to know Amos Oz when I was at Tel Aviv University in 1996. We became very good friends, and there I started to translate my Michael Mihailishvili. In the last more than 20 years, I translated his 9 books, including my Michael Mihailishvili, A Tale of Love and Darkness, Sipu al-Havavi Hoshekh, Black Books, Kufsa Shahra, and Scenes from Village Life, and so on. Now I'm working on his 10 books and the 10th of his books. Some of them were sold well and got praise in China. Except for Amos Oz, I also translated Gershon Shekad's modern Hebrew fiction, Yehushua Knat's After the Holidays, and Samech Izhar's Herbert Hiza. Now, I'm serving as the director of the Department of Oriental Literary Studies at the Institute of Foreign Literature at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. The major work for us is to do research and translation in foreign literature and culture. There are also other Hebrew authors or poets such as Yehuda Amihai, Nathan Zah, Yonah Valeh, David Grossman, who were translated into Chinese by my colleagues. There are 3 literary and research magazines in our institute. All of them have published research essays or translations in Israeli literature. Among them, the translation magazine Journal of World Literature published the first special issues on Israeli literature, including Hebrew classics, younger generation writers. For instance, at that time, the younger generation writers means David Grossman, Meir Shalev, and so on. And Holocaust literature. In this special issue, we published the short stories by Aharon Appelfeld, Karl Zetnik, and so on, and women literature. In cooperation with the Israeli Embassy in Beijing and the Israeli Consulate in Shanghai, we invited Amos Oz to visit China in 2010 and arranged a series of lectures and events, which brought great attention to contemporary Israeli literature from Chinese publishers, intellectuals, and common readers. We also held a seminar on Amos Oz in our institute in China. Actually, this was the first time such a seminar devoted to the writers of a single Hebrew writer had been held in China. Among the participants, there were Mo Yan, the Nobel Prize laureate and Yan Lianke winner of Kafka Prize, and other distinguished authors and scholars. More than 40 influential Chinese newspapers and magazines published articles, reports, or review essays on this event. The visit of Amos Oz to us could be seen as a breakthrough in literary exchange between China and Israel. In March 2010, invited by the Bookworm Festival, David Grossman, another distinguished Hebrew author, came to visit Beijing and Shanghai and delivered several lectures. Cooperated with Professor Igor Schwartz, my PhD mentor, we organized 2 conferences in literary studies. One is literature and national awareness. The other is nation and narration in China and Israel. Participants came from China and Israel respectively. The conference was well publicized. Both sides learned a lot from each other. Igor Schwartz concluded that Jews are always on the way to the land of Israel, and so, in a certain sense, the closer they get to it, the more distant it becomes. That inspired us to give more thought to the past, the present, and the future of Israel. At the meantime, we have been doing research in Israeli literature, culture, and society. and published academic works such as 20th Century Hebrew Literature in Transition and a study of contemporary Israeli authors, and so on. Chinese Academy of Social Sciences actually is a think tank in China. Before 2017, we only had MA and PhD program, but now, after 2017, we established a University of Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. We have master and PhD degree and in Jewish and Hebrew literature. The students now are working in the field of medieval Hebrew poetry, Jewish Holocaust studies from the perspective of victimizers, and a study of the novels by Aharon Appelfeld, Aleph Beit Yeshua, and David Grossman. And we just finished the translation of The Rebirth of Hebrew Literature by Professor Igor Schwartz. We hope the younger generation scholars will continue to work hard in this field. We also look forward more cooperation and exchanges in literature and culture between two great civilized countries in the future. Thank you for your attention. That's all for my presentation.
Thank you, Professor Dong Qian.
I think we can now hear the presentation by Dr. Lehi Yariv, because the share screen is working. So should we do that? Lee?
Can you?
Yes, we can hear you. Okay.
You can hear me. You can see the presentation or not?
Yes, we can see the presentation.
Click on the presentation.
All right.
Click on it.
And now.
Yeah.
Click on it, Lee.
Yeah, I click on it. Yeah. Now?
Yeah. Very good. Okay. And you
All
have
right. All right.
And you have, I just mentioned,
so,
Lee.
I apologize.
Lee, I just mentioned that there is precisely 10 minutes, okay? For you and
all
for
right. No problem. I apologize and I thank you very much.
Thank you.
For inviting me. Okay, so China studies in Israel, how it all began, and I mean the academic field, not the diplomatic relations. And what I would like to say today refers to what happened before 1992. There were 34 years of unilateral academic moves from both sides, one from China and one from Israel. And I would like to pay respect, to pay homage to two founders of the academic field that started 64 years ago. In China, it was Professor Xu Xiangqun. In Israel, it was Professor Tzvi Shifrin. In China, Professor Xu Xiangqun, he was studying by himself Hebrew and was teaching Hebrew to a group of students in Beijing. He also translated into Chinese a complete Hebrew-English dictionary that was published in 1965. Here you can see the dictionary. And it's a huge dictionary. Why it is so big? Because Professor Xu Xiangqun put, as you can see on the screen, put Chinese within the dictionary. He put Chinese, and this was something very in a pioneer work, a pioneer action in China. His students continued, and also in Beijing, we know that Xu Zheping was his student. Now, what happened in Israel? At the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in 1958, Professor Tzvi Shifrin started to teach courses on the history of China. Who was Professor Shifrin? Professor Shifrin was born in the United States, in the city of New York. And he was sent by the American Army to study Chinese. So he became interested in the China field. And in 1948, he immigrated to Israel. Now, for some years later, he came to the authorities of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And he said, it is impossible, totally impossible that in the entire state of Israel and in the Middle East, nobody studies China. So they said, okay, please start teaching about China. He started teaching. And then he collected teachers who taught the Chinese language, Professor Donald Leslie, Mr. Leon Yankelevich, Mr. Lev Rubachov, etc. But in 1968, he established a new department at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. It was in 1968. It was called the Chinese and Japanese Studies Department at the Hebrew University. This department later changed its names to the name of East Asian Studies and then later Asian Studies Department. What he did, Professor Schifrin, he collected experts and researchers from all over the world. For example, in 1968, a lady by the name of Mrs. Dora Schickman, Wenhuda, from Beijing, 1968, arrived at the Hebrew University, and she was the first Chinese language teacher for many, many students. And these are some of the books that she compiled to study Chinese. He also invited an expert on the People's Liberation Army, Professor Yoffe, who I guess that some of you know him, Ellis Yoffe, who passed away some years ago. And this is the first generation of sinologists in Israel. They educated many diplomats, historians, etc., that I'll show you in a minute. Now, in 1996, other universities such as Tel Aviv University, and then later, much later, Haifa University, Tel Chai Academic College, also established departments of Asian studies, of China studies in Israel. And these are the new generation at the Hebrew University. These are experts. I'm sure you know some of them. This is the teacher, the Chinese language teacher who came after Mrs. Schickman. Her name is Lin Qian. All this is the product of the start made by Professor Schifrin at the Hebrew University. And these are some of the books of the researchers by the specialists at the Hebrew University. And also here you can see some of the cultural activities. You see here Wang Yu with myself as representatives of the Confucius Institute at the Hebrew University. And also what you see here is some of the diplomats. You see on the right side, Mrs. Ruth Kahanov, that was mentioned by Professor Pan Guang. She was the first secretary when the embassy of Israel was established in China with the ambassador Zev Sufot. And up you see Mr. Shagrir from the Foreign Office, and down you see the current ambassador, Her Excellency Irit Ben Abba Vitale, who just opened this conference. And she was also, all of them, graduates of the Hebrew University. Now, I believe in language and grammar exchange, in 互相理解, in mutual understanding that comes from language learning. And what you see on the one side, when it says Shibola Yu Yufa, is a book by Professor Xu Xiangqun. Xu Xiangqun is I say is a great man in China and in Israel. We celebrate Professor Tzvi Shifrin. Tzvi Shifrin was born in 1922. In September, this September, he will be 100 years old, and I really think that these two men deserve our respect. Professor Shifrin was awarded the Israel Prize for 2015 for establishing the China field and East Asian field in Israel. And thank you, and thank these two men very much. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And let's welcome next speaker. Next speaker is Professor Qiao Guoqiang from Shanghai International Studies University. The presentation is entitled Jewish Studies at SISU, an Introduction. Professor Qiao Guoqiang, please. 你没有打开声音。声音打开声音，听不到你这个声音没有打开。哎，好了。
Okay. All right.
Yes.
Hello, dear colleague and friend. I should say good evening rather than good afternoon. It's a great honor for me to participate in this great event. I would like to thank Professor Field first of all. And at this event, I would, of course, I should say congratulations on the 30th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relation between China and Israel. My talk would be focused on a brief introduction to the Jewish study at the Shanghai International Study University. The abbreviation is SDU. That's the picture. The first picture is our university, and there's a place of our institute. First of all, about the institute. Honestly, we are not actually in the so-called Jewish study, but we are somewhere around the corner of Jewish study. We are actually doing the Jewish literary study. So that's about the institute. This institute was established on December 27th, 2018, a newly established institute. On June the 12th, 2019, Professor Li Yansong, the president of SDU, unveiled the present plaque of the institute at the opening ceremony of the third International Conference on Jewish Study, organized and hosted by our institute. Currently, I'm the dean of the institute, aiming at serving as the SDU's overall project of development. The institute is now engaged primarily in the study of Jewish literature and culture, while consolidating SDU's traditional strengths in Jewish literary study. The institute commits to carrying out research in the field in the area of literary study and comparative literature, in hope to becoming one of China's major platform in the area. The institute will gradually expand its research area and build expertise in Jewish literary criticism, Hebrew literature, and Israeli study, and therefore to ensure a sustainable development. There's the faculty. The first one is myself, is the Dean of Institute, PhD from the University of Nottingham, UK, and also a professor, a Chandong scholar, distinguished professor of English and language and literature. Professor Li Feng is a PhD from Nanjing University, Fulbright research scholar at Columbia University, and the assistant research fellow Wu Cheng is PhD from Fudan University, and visiting scholar from Duke University, and the postdoc already completed it from Shanghai International Study University, and now is a research fellow at the Institute. Peng Wei is a PhD from Beijing Foreign Language Study University, Fulbright visiting scholar at the Pennsylvania State University, and currently he is a postdoc at the Institute. The last one is Liu Yongsheng, is an undergraduate major in Hebrew from the CSU. Now work as a research assistant in the Institute and responsible for part of the administrative work. The major academic collaboration. The Institute has been collaborated in with Shanghai Jewish Refugee Museum, whose large collection of documents and archive will provide valuable resources for the Institute research on Shanghai Ghetto literature and Holocaust literature. And these two areas we are working on presently. The purpose of such research to restore the historical truth and to display the Chinese people's humanistic spirit, to voice Chinese scholars' understanding in Jewish literary studies. On the initiative of the Institute, CSU signed the international agreement with the Institute of Literary Study of Research Center for the Humanity and the Hungarian Academy of Science. The agreement aimed at promoting academic cooperation for exchange of the student, faculty, staff, researcher, and member of the technical and administrative staff. The Institute has also established a close academic relationship with scholars from Columbia University, University of Pennsylvania, Brandeis University, Tulane University, etc., etc. For the time being, I have to, omit it. The major academic event aiming to promote academic research and exchange in Jewish literary history, philosophy, and culture, the Institute of Jewish Study hosts a forum of Jewish study serial lecture on campus. The primary focus is currently placed on such topics as Jewish literature in Britain and the US, Israel culture and literature, Shanghai Jewish refugee, Holocaust study, and Jewish immigration study. The lecture delivered by renowned scholars from home and abroad has attracted faculty and students from many other institutions of higher learning, including University of Chinese Academy of Social Science, Shandong University, Nanjing University, etc., etc. Okay. We are also the sponsor and the organizer of an international conference of Jewish study. The theme of the conference is Jewish study from an interdisciplinary perspective. scholars from China, US, Sweden, Britain, Germany, Israel, and Japan attend the event. The conferences provide an important platform of academic exchange for scholars from various cultures and disciplines. And its success promotes the development of China's Jewish study. Specifically, before and after the establishment of the Institute, Professor Qiao and myself organized and hosted 4 sessions of the conference. That the first is at SDU, the second co-hosted with Zhejiang Gongshang University, and the third is again at SDU. The fourth one that happened last year in the Northeast Normal University. The picture took at the conference. The first one is the president of SDU gives the opening speech. The Professor Fu De and Professor Zhong Zhiqing, Professor Gaidi, again Professor Xiao Xian. Yeah, that's myself. That's the conference. Okay, the second part of my speech will say a few words about myself. Say a few words or boasting a few words about myself. I'm a PhD from the University of Nottingham, Changjiang scholar, distinguished professor, and used to be a special lecturer at School of American and Canadian Study, University of Nottingham, and also used to be Liverpool Trust Professor at School of English, University of Leicester, UK, and visiting professor of University of Leicester, and also working as the vice president of China National Association for the Study of American Literature, the executive vice president of the Narratology Committee of China Association of Theory of Literary and Art. A lot of vice president, so I just mentioned to name a few. And my academic interest are mainly on the American Jewish literature, narrative theory, and literary theory, and a comparative literary study. I'm the sponsor and organizer of the Conference of the International Jewish Study in China, which has been held for conference since 2016. Also of more than 24 of books, such as All You Cry You Men, The Jewishness of Isaac Bashevis Singer, American Jewish Literature, etc., etc. Okay, also about 200 essays and articles, widely published on some international journals, such as New Helican Comparative Literature and Culture, Comparative Literary Study, European Review, ANQ Journal, etc., etc. Okay, and also I have supervised about 60 PhD students and postdocs. Most of them are working in the area of American Jewish literary study. That's the book published so far. Okay. That's the speech delivered at the University of University of Virginia in the 2015. That's the picture, and also another lecture I gave at the University of Brandeis. And the speech I gave at the University of Leicester. Okay, the The purpose I to boast to myself as an, I'm a rather a greenhorn of a fresh hand in the area of Jewish study. So I would like to take this opportunity to make myself known or well known. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you, Professor Qiao Guoqiang. Next speaker is Professor Fu Xiaowei from Sichuan International Studies University. Her presentation is on Jewish and Israeli Studies at Sichuan International Studies University. Professor Fu Xiaowei, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay, thank you. Hope they can. Right. Dear colleagues, it's a great honor for me to attend this special forum for the 30th anniversary of Sino-Israel diplomatic relations, and also a celebration of joint effort of Chinese and Israeli scholars to promote the mutual understanding of the two peoples. I am so excited to hear interesting stories of those pioneers of Jewish and Israeli studies in China and Israel. And for me, I will just give a brief introduction of the Jewish and Israel studies at SDU in Chongqing, Sichuan International Studies University. The Center for Judaic and Chinese Studies was founded in 2006. During the past 17 years, our research field has been expanded from Jewish literature to a much wider range, from comparative studies of Chinese and Jewish literature and culture to Hebrew literature and Israel studies. In 2010, I cooperated with Chris Witt with her newly established Sino-Israel Global Network and Academic Leadership to start the first ever Israel Studies program in our university to develop a multifaceted Israel Studies program in which opportunities for learning were offered to both educators and students. And a few months after this initial introduction, Israel's ambassador Amos Nadai facilitated over the first SDU paper contest for Jewish Israel study, and then presided over the first ever Israel Business Forum in Chongqing. The ambassador called our program a significant contribution to greater mutual understanding between our nations. Since then, we started a teaching and research group for Israel studies, and then we set up the Center of Israel Studies in 2012. And in the following, I will introduce our works from 4 categories: research, teaching, student training, and serving the local. For research, up to now, we have published 7 monographs on Jewish writers and Jewish philosophers, such as I.B. Singer's writing and his influence in Chinese contemporary writing, a study of monadics, interpretation, etc. And we published about 70 essays, both in Chinese and English, involved or on Jewish literature, philosophy, and Israel studies. And my focus on comparative studies of Jewish and Chinese literature and American Jewish writers. And we also published 10 Jewish novels and academic works from, including The Jew in the Modern World, a documentary history, and Resurrection, the Power of God for Jews and Christians, etc. And now we have been, since 2010, working on 2 translation series, that is Contemporary Western Source and Jewish Traditions, supported by the National General Administration of Press and Publication, and the Jewish Wisdom and the Jewish Innovative Thinking. In 2020, the Center for Israel Studies started to publish Israel Study, a collection of papers issued annually. It also published reports on Israel and Middle East studies, international relations of the scholars in SDU. We have finished 8 research programs supported by the National Social Science Foundation, the Ministry of Education, and the Chongqing Social Science Foundation. Now we are seeking wider and deeper cooperation with other institutions and universities, home and abroad. This year, we have been working with the translation department of Bar Ilan on programs such as the study of the translation of Hebrew literature and its influence in China and the diaspora literature. And the second part is about teaching and training in SDU. We don't have students majoring in Jewish study or Israel studies, except for the 10 undergraduates for Hebrew language learning. So teaching about the Jewish culture or about Israel is mainly through some selective courses and lecture series to the undergraduate and postgraduate students. We offer some topics in our courses related to Judaism, Jewish literature, Israel, or the comparative study of Hebrew Bible and Confucian classics. Such courses such as translation and communication, religion and American politics, and English literature, comparative literature, introduction to the Bible, and etc. And the second way to training the students is through the training programs. Since 2010, we worked with Signal Bar Ilan to offer study programs for undergraduate and graduate students, as well as opportunities for teachers to be trained in Israel studies. Each year, the center sends graduate students and teachers to attend the summer school seminars by Shandong University, Brandeis University, Bar Ilan, Ben Gurion University, Tel Aviv, etc., to enlarge their knowledge of Jewish and Israel culture. The other way is through lectures and paper contests. From 2011 to 2018, before the pandemic, supported by Signal and the Sino-Judaic Institute in the US, we organized the annual paper contest, which usually lasts from more than 6 months. During the 6 to 7 months, more than 100 candidates, graduates and undergraduate students from different colleges applied for this contest. They were asked to attend lectures offered by professors of the center and professors from other institutions at home and abroad, usually from Israel, Australia, Britain, and USA. And these lectures on Israel and Jewish literature and culture, Bible and biblical literature, Middle East international relations, Israeli politics, foreign relations, culture and society, etc. And these organized activities, I should say, they were very successful. Some participants became so interested in Jewish and Israel studies that they went to Israel for further studies. And we also find it a very useful way to teach about Jewish and Israel culture from guiding students' translation practice. We would provide the students essays or books on Jewish or Israeli cultures, by giving lectures and analyzing their own translations. Students came to see how misreading of Judaism or lack of knowledge about Jewish culture or Israeli cultures started in the translation of Jewish works would impact other researchers and ordinary readers in their understanding of Jews and Jewish culture. Because of these programs, the lecture series, the graduate forum for Jewish culture, the paper contests for Jewish and Israeli studies on campus during 2011 and 2014, quite some reports and interviews about our center were found in Jerusalem Post, Economist, Wall Street Journal, South China Morning Post, and Israel Hayom, etc. And the fourth we do is to serve the local government. We help promote cultural and economic exchanges between Chongqing and Israeli cities. For example, we work with institutions such as NOFA Institute for Strategic and Defense Studies and Chongqing International Exchange Centers to host the forums on Sino-Israel relations, Middle East studies, and also to host the first China-Israel Startup Economy Development Forum. We also introduced the Israel Project signal the Israel-Asia Chamber of Commerce to bring famous Israeli writers and scholars to Chongqing for cultural exchanges, and to bring entrepreneurs to attend the Chongqing high-tech fair, or to work with the Foreign Trade and Economic Relations Commission, the International Exchange Center, the Municipal Science and Technology Commission in Chongqing. Finally, I would sincerely welcome all the colleagues to attending this forum, to visit our university, and to give lectures to our teachers and students. That's the brief introduction of our work at SDU in Chongqing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Hu Xiaowei. Now it's time for Professor Wang Yu to present. And the title of her presentation is A Pioneer Going Ahead, Introduction to the Hebrew Program at Peking University. Welcome, Professor Wang Yu.
Hi, hello everyone. Can you see my PPT? Oh,
yes.
Okay, great. One moment. Where is PPT? Okay, here it is. Good afternoon and good evening. I'm Wang Yu from Peking University. I'm very happy to be here today, and many thanks to the organizer of this event for providing us such a great opportunity to meet the old friends and the new friends from Israel and from China. I would like to share mine and my colleagues' experience as witness of this prosperous bilateral relationship between China and Israel. I would like to start with the introduction to the Hebrew program at Peking University. As Professor Xu Xin just mentioned, this program was the first modern Hebrew program in China. It was established in 1985, 7 years before the official diplomatic ties between China and Israel. During the past decades, more than 100, we have trained with more than 100 BA students and a dozen of MA students, and many of them are working in Chinese universities and research institutions. This program at Peking University has been considered as a hub of Hebrew educators and researchers in China. One of the founders of this program, Mrs. Xu Zheping Shula, is a common teacher of many Hebrew educators in China, including myself and many other colleagues. During the past, in the last year, we finally launched a new PhD program in our department, and started to train the first PhD students in the field of Israel studies. As a pioneer in teaching Hebrew in China, our program has laid great emphasis to the discipline construction. The faculty members compiled and edited the first Hebrew textbooks in China, and also reference books in Chinese. The handbook, 300 sentences in Hebrew, has been republished many times and became the preferred Hebrew language introductory book for those who intend to go to Israel to study or to work. The faculty members also published academic works and monographs, translation works. We also carried out quite a lot of research projects, and the major projects were supported by the National Social Science Foundation and the Ministry of Education. In recent years, we moved the focus to area studies. As you may see here, our research fields cover also the history of the Near East and the modern state of Israel's politics and society. Regarding the international communication and cooperation, actually this Hebrew program at Peking University was established with support from Israel. In the first years, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Israel recruited and sent to us the first Hebrew teachers. And in nowadays, not in nowadays, from the beginning of the previous decade, almost all our students, either BA or MA students, have the opportunity to go to Israel to study, at least for one academic semester. The study in Israel is primarily funded by the Chinese Scholarship Council with cooperation with the Council of Higher Education in Israel. And some students go to Israel and study there in the framework of exchange program between Peking University and Hebrew University and Tel Aviv University. As I have noted, many of our graduates continue to pursue their PhD and MA and PhD studies in the leading universities in Israel and also in the United States. Myself is an example. I got my MA from the Hebrew University and PhD from Haifa University. This kind of joint training between Peking Chinese University and the leading universities in Israel contribute greatly to the faculty recruitment in the relevant fields in China. We also invite famous scholars from Israel and from other countries to come to give lectures in Peking University, including Professor Sami Smucha, Eli Podeh, Hillel Cohen, and others. We also organize and participate in in many conferences, international conferences, and hope next time we can organize conference and we can meet finally face to face. The Hebrew program at Peking University also has a long history of cooperation with the Israeli universities. We have the joint Confucius Institute with the Hebrew University, and I had the honor to be sent as the first Chinese director of this CI. And I worked with Li He for 3 years. I have to say that was, for me, personally speaking, a wonderful 3 years. And I learned a lot about the way of teaching, way of working, and way of thinking in Israel. And this information I could not obtain from the reading of materials or books. Looking into the future, I have to confess that I'm quite agree with Professor Zhang Ping that I'm less optimistic about the bilateral relationship between China and Israel because of the pressure from the US in nowadays. But as a Hebrew educator, I'm quite optimistic about the future of Hebrew and Jewish and Israel studies in China. In recent years, with the increase of interest among Chinese businessmen, officials, scholars, and public in general in Israel as a nation of innovation and the rapid growth of new positions related to Israel and the Jewish studies in Chinese academia. More and more, our students and other students are attracted to this field, and many of them are willing to be engaged in this profession. And because of this, I'm quite optimistic because I think on both sides, there are scholars and there are there are people who think the friendship is very important for both of us and the cooperation as well. So I think in the future, the scholars from both sides can contribute, can educate and contribute to this bilateral relationship between China and Israel. Well, thank you everyone, and toda rabba. Bye.
Thank you, Professor Wang Yu. The next speaker is Professor Lei Yu, and the title of her presentation is Teaching and Researching Activities of the Center for Israel Studies at Northwestern University. Professor Lei Yu, please. Yes, Professor Lei Yu, please.
Yes, I heard you. That's okay?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Dear colleagues and friends, good afternoon, good morning. I'm very honored to be invited to participate in the forum for 30th anniversary of Sino-Israel diplomatic relations. It is also my pleasure to meet all of you. I really appreciate the opportunity to introduce some of our research and teaching activities in Israel studies at Northwestern University. Generally speaking, we have a strong advantage to carry Israel research and teaching because there is a prestigious institution at Northwestern University. It is IMES, the Institute of Middle Eastern Studies. In 1964, IMES was established under the approval of the State Council of China. It is one of the first few institutions to conduct international issues studies in China. IMES was also the first institution studying IMES was also the first Chinese institution study PhD program in Middle East studies, and also the first institution providing master's degree in Jewish history. Fortunately, I was the first graduate student in Jewish studies in IMES, even though not the best. A large number of excellent alumni had made tremendous contributions to Chinese academia. Professor Xiao Xian and Professor Zhang Qianhong, who were attending the forum as well, are the best examples of our alumni. Broadly speaking, Jewish study and Israel studies in China were originally from Northwestern University has made many achievements. As early as 1986, Professor Yan Ruisong introduced Abba Eban's book, My People, The Story of Jews to Chinese readers. It was one of the earliest publications about Jewish studies, which was groundbreaking in Jewish studies in China. In 1992, Professor Yan Ruisong and his wife, Professor Xu Fang, translated Walter Lacker's book, A History of Zionism. Even today, these two books are still being widely referred in academic research. In addition, we published several books, such as The Politics of Israel, edited by Professor Yan Ruisong, and another book, Guiding to World States Israel, edited by Professor Huang Mingxing and me. We have also published multiple papers in Israel studies. At the same time, Professor Yan Ruisong started on teaching the course Jewish history for undergraduate and graduate students. I have been teaching this course since 2005. 2005. In recent years, we have increased research and cultural communications with universities and institutions abroad. Based on the proposal by Ms. Chris White, the founder of Signal, the Center of Israel Studies at Northwest University was established in 2014. The founder deputy ambassador of Israeli embassy in China attended the establishment ceremony and gave a speech. Our center aims at high-level research and teaching. With the support of Signal, we continuously held 8 paper competitions about Jewish and Israel studies after 2014. More and more students from Peking University, Henan University, Shanxi Normal University joined us and joined our paper competitions. I truly hope that the international forum will help bring the Israeli studies at Northwest to a higher level. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Lei Yu. And now next speaker is Professor Hu Hao from Henan University. The title of his presentation is Jewish and Israel Studies at Henan University. Welcome, Professor Hu Hao. Yeah.听不见声音，听不见声，刚才说了一声，现在听不见了。胡浩听不见声音。胡浩听不见声音。胡浩，胡老师听不见你的声音。胡老师，你能听到我说话吗？我们听不到你的声音。
现在呢，可以吗？
啊，可以了。
可以了是吧 ？OK。In 2002, the Institute of Jewish Studies was founded by Professor Zhang Qianhong, and in 2012, the institute was changed into the Center for Israel Studies, engaged in comprehensive research on Judaism, Jewish history and culture, Jewish diaspora in China, anti-Semitism, Holocaust, Israel studies, and so on. The center provides MA and PhD program, also receive postdoctoral. It aims to promote Jewish and Israel studies in China and achieve a better understanding between Israel and China. In 2017, the center was chosen by Chinese Ministry of Education as one of the record centers for national and regional studies. And in April 2018, was selected as a council unit of the Belt and Road Think Tank Alliance. In 2020, the Center for Israel Studies was selected into the Chinese Think Tank Index as one of the important think tanks of China. The faculty, Professor Zhang Qianhong, the founder and the former director of the center. She is a very productive scholar, published 20 books and more than 100 articles on Jewish and Israel topics. Now she is the vice president of Shandong University. Dr. Gerald Gautel just Professor Zhang Qianhong introduced, he made great contribution to the development of our center. But unfortunately, he passed away because of the serious heart disease. Professor Zhang Ligang, a former executive director of the center, his major is about
有没有声音了？
可能是网络的问题。5号又没有声音了。
5号是网络的事儿吗？
应该是吧。
5号，你能听到我吗？胡老师？
胡老师，
现在刚才没声音了你再继续讲。现在可以了。
OK. And Dr. Aaron Gui is a very productive young scholar and a promising scholar in China doing Israel studies. He writes a book, Masada Myths and the Shaping of Israel Connective Memory. And also as a deputy editor of Israeli Development Report. And Dr. Liu Bailu is mainly do research about Chinese Jewry. Dr. Ma Danjing is a PhD. Is mainly doing Russia Jews studies. And she translated Simon Sebek's Montefield's book, Jerusalem, the biography, a very popular book in China. And Dr. Liu Hongjie is a PhD from Shandong University with scholar at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He do research about Israel city, Israel society. We provide all kinds of courses for undergraduates and graduate students, such as Jewish history, the history of Israel, Middle East history, and literature courses, selected readings on Jewish and Israel studies literature, and about modern Jewish history courses, Jewish intellectual history, the history of world religion, including Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Our research projects and publications. Up until now, our faculty has published about 30 books and more than 200 articles on Jewish and Israel topics, and undertaking more than 10 National Social Science Foundation research projects, including the major project, A General History of Jewish People, about 6 volumes, is predicted in near future. This is some of our books published. It's Jerusalem, I have said, and Israel's road to economic revitalization is Professor Zhang Qianhong's, and the first Israel history in China, wrote by Professor Zhang Qianhong. And these 2 books, Israel a History and Jewish Civilization is the latest translation books. Israel History is Alita Shapir's work, translated by me and my colleague Aaron Gui. And Jewish Civilization is Essen Staats, a very famous sociologist in Israel. It's translated by me and two doctoral students. Also, we have some other books. For example, Jewish Culture, Professor Zhang Qianhong and Aaron Gui's work. The first history of Judaism in China, and some other books. In these years, we published a very, very important series. It's about annual reports on Israel's national development. Just as Professor Xu Xin said, if in 20 years or 30 years ago, we cannot imagine we can do the same, but now we can do. We did a very successfully. This is some topic journals. In these journals, we published more than 200 articles. Also, we published some articles in foreign journals, such as Jewish Studies. In the past years, our center had many conferences and seminars on Jewish and Israel studies, especially international conference on Holocaust education and research. This conference held in 2012 memorized the 10th anniversary of the establishment of our center. This conference is about Israel studies and Middle East studies about hot issues in Israel and Middle East. It is in 2018, we heard a conference about Israel studies and regional studies. Our faculty also attended international conference and did research abroad. I want to show some of. It's Professor Zhang Qianhong was invited to Israel presidential conference and gave lecture. It's Professor Zhang Nigang attends the conference and held by the University of Mainz, Germany. Dr. Ma Danjing do her postdoctoral research at Ben Gurion University, sponsored by Israel government. This is me. I attended 2018 ESCAP Summer Institute about critical anti-Semitism studies at Oxford University. We also send students studying abroad. This is some pictures about our students attending abroad. This is Shu Huilin, who attended the Holocaust seminar at Jerusalem. This is the pictures our students visited Jerusalem. In the past years, many scholars visited us. I show you some of them. This is Jonathan Sala, president of the Association for Jewish Studies, visited Hainan University and gave lecture. And also, we appointed him as a part-time professor. This is Aaron Sihalova, a Nobel laureates in chemistry visit our institute. It is Professor Lane from Ben Gurion University gave summer courses about 2 weeks courses for us. And this is David Myers, University of California, visited us and lectured at the summer seminar. Maro Mezzini, professor of Hebrew University at Tel Aviv University, gave a lecture for us. Okay. In the past years, the most important academic activity, I think, is Holocaust education. We cooperate with Shandong University, Nanjing University, had many times conference about this. And Dr. Jerry Gautier is most important mediator, organizer, and sponsor of these activities. We have libraries, special Jewish and Israel libraries collecting many foreign language materials and books. Also, we buy some books every year. Langhill, one of the most important sponsors of centers, initiate and sponsor annual paper competition on Jewish studies since establishment of center. And since 2012, Sigler joined and sponsored the activity. Until now, over 1,000 students from more than 30 universities and institutes have participated in the paper competition. Some high quality papers were recommended to be published on top academic journals in China. This is some pictures show the activity. Now we have special programs cooperating with Sigler. We have established the connection since 2010 with Sigler. Israel Studies Faculty Training Program, Sigler offers scholarships to teachers and PhD who are supposed to attend the 3-month training program at Israel universities. Sigler also helped us to apply for the 2-year MA program on Israel Studies. And with the collaboration of Sigler in editing the Blue Book of Israel, annual report on Israel national development, Sigler has made great effort to provide latest materials and dates and information about contemporary Israel, and also contribute some articles to the series of the book. That's my presentation. Thank you for your everyone's listening. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hu Hao. Now it's my turn. I would like to ask you to share my presentation. The title is Encounter with Judaism and the Jewish Israeli Studies in Shandong University. This is the faculty team. Good afternoon, good evening. While celebrating the 30th anniversary of diplomatic relations between China and Israel, as a scholar working on Jewish studies for 30 years, I have a lot of memories and facts to share with you. My engagement with Jewish studies is somehow connected with a few coincidences. First, the diplomatic relations was established on January 24th. It happened to be my birthday. Secondly, in the same year when I was preparing for the translation of Spinoza's Hebrew grammar into Chinese, I miraculously received a brochure about the one-year postgraduate program of Jewish Studies at Oxford University. I successfully applied for the program and arrived in Oxford after the summer of 1992, exactly 30 years. Since then, I have been engaged with Jewish Studies till now. Another coincidence is about my name. My name is Yoda. It sounds very similar to the Hebrew name Yehuda or Yoda in German, Polish, and Italian. Therefore, many Jewish friends asked me if my name was a Jewish name. I told them my name is a very typical Chinese name with dense Confucian Taoist colors. The similarity of my name of a Jewish name, the same date of the diplomatic relation and the establishment with my birthday and my admission to the postgraduate program in Oxford, all these are coincidences. While looking back to this coincidence, I can't help imagining of an invisible hand guiding my academic life. Indeed, the real motivation which made me transfer from the history of Western philosophy to Jewish studies 30 years ago was my concern with the cultural transformation of China. While reading the Bible, Mishnah, listening to the lectures of Maimonides and other Jewish philosophers, participating in synagogue service and Shabbat meals, I, from time to time, embraced the following questions. In which direction would China progress in the future? How should we deal with the religions in a basically secular country? What could we learn from the change of Judaism while reshaping modern Chinese culture? During my stay in Oxford and London, as well as in Israel and the USA later, these questions pushed me to explore the Jewish wisdom in order to find possible solutions. So this is the real motivation. This motivation is more determinant for me than the above mentioned coincidences. So what I have done in Jewish is really studies. As soon as I returned from Britain via Israel after the summer of 1994, I immediately established the Institute for Jewish Cultural Studies at Shandong University. The first thing we did was the translations of Jewish masterpieces, Judaism on Trial, Maimonides, Guide for the Perplexed, the Mishnah, and others. Now we can see 16 books published by Shandong University Press, and all of them are being reprinted by the commercial press in Beijing. In addition to the series of translation, we also translated Marvin Tolkien's 5 books of Jewish wisdom into Chinese. These translations have provided basic materials for academia in China. So the translations. Apart from translations, our Jewish studies mainly focus on the following 4 areas. First, history of Jewish philosophy and religion. We published the modern history of Jewish philosophy, library of doctoral dissertations, and several books about Bible studies by Professor Archie and Shandong-Israel, a good number of articles on Jewish religion and philosophy in Chinese and English. 2. Comparative studies between Judaism and Confucianism. A variety of papers about this topic has been published in Chinese and English journals by Dong Xiuyuan, Wang Qiangwei, and me. A collection of my essays of comparative studies entitled A Stone from Another Mountain, Jews versus Chinese, just appeared recently. Thirdly, studies on diaspora roots. Its representative work is the 3-volume Encyclopedia of Diaspora Roots, edited by Aviv. Fourthly, studies on Israeli society. A number of papers about kibbutz, religious party and Israeli politics, immigrants in Israel, the Orthodox Jews in COVID-19 pandemic, have been published, and 5 research projects have been initiated by the SDU-TAU Joint Institute. Moreover, I created the Journal of Jewish Studies in 2002, and 19 volumes have been published and welcomed by a great number of readers. The journal and academic activities. The Center for Judaic and Interreligious Studies at Shandong University became one of the key research institutes of humanities and social sciences in China in 2004. It is sponsored by the Ministry of Education and our university. It has extended its research fields to current Israel in the name of SDU-TAU Joint Institute of Jewish and Israel Studies and Shandong-Israel Exchange Cooperation and Research Center. We have master and PhD programs and have already trained 40 students for master and 28 doctoral students of Jewish studies. In the past 3 decades, I have increasingly realized that both Jews and Chinese are great peoples with many similarities in morality, way of life, highly regarded education, hardworking, enormous courage and endurance, etc. Judaism as an ethical monotheism may inspire Chinese to deepen their thought. Their distinct way of thinking and disputations could be helpful in scientific research and humanities studies. The spirit of community is beneficial to establish just social order. Modern Judaism, especially its Reform Judaism, could tell us to accept both modernity and tradition, both universal values and particular characteristics, both sanctification and secularism. These viewpoints, through our lectures and publications, have been disseminated and impacted our students and a good number of Chinese people. Jewish culture is valuable, very referential to the current reconstruction of Chinese culture. In the future, Shandong University will concentrate on the 2 following aspects. First, we will strengthen our studies of Judaism and Jewish thought by developing Jewish Bible studies, Talmudic studies, history of philosophy and religion, etc. Secondly, we will make more efforts to put forward our Israel studies. And will while developing most aspect of Israel studies and Sino-Israel relationship, we'll do our best to cooperate with the colleagues in Tel Aviv University and other Israeli universities to developing research programs, student exchange, and summer schools, international conference, and other academic activities. I believe that we will surely make a steadfast progress in promotion of mutual understanding, mutual respect, mutual learning, and mutual benefit between the Jews and the Chinese. Thank you. This is my presentation. I would like to say, and all of the presentations have been over. And thank you all of the speakers and for your wonderful presentations. Whether you recalling the history or talking about what you have done, what you are doing now, and what you will do in the future. All of the presentations are very impressive. Should I open my eyes? Very impressive. And so now it's time for us to close our forum by a presentation by Professor Shawich. Now, Professor Yuri Shawich is the co-head of the SDU-TAU Joint Institute. Now, welcome, Professor Shawich.
Thank you. Thank you, Yuda. I'll be very brief because it was a packed day. I will not take advantage of the entire 15 minutes I was given. And let me first thank all the people who were with us throughout this incredible conference. Most of you started and stayed. We appreciate that very much. And all the wonderful presentations. But my main thank you is to you, Yuda, my friend and colleague. I mean, this was your initiative, this conference. And I think it was splendidly done and gave us a wonderful understanding of what has been done and what is planned to be done with regards to Jewish studies and Israel studies and Jewish Confucian studies in China, in Shandong University and beyond it. So thank you very much for this and for your academic leadership of our institute. I also take the opportunity to thank your incredible assistant, Yan, who was also, as always, very helpful. So many cheers for her, for the work she did. And we did much less this time. And I nevertheless would like to thank Karl Juncker, who put a great deal of effort on our part, and also Inbal Shamir, and to take the opportunity to congratulate her on the good news she shared with us just a few weeks ago. I have to say, it was, for me, incredible to see how much work is being done, has been done over the past 2-3 decades in China with regards to Israel studies and Chinese studies. Often, also in the title of this conference, we use the terms Chinese-Israeli, Sino-Israeli relations, Jewish, Confucian. There is something, I think it's always very important, especially for Israelis to remember. When we say China and Israel, these are not exactly entities that are equal in size. There are in the world today around 15 million Jews. There are 9 million Israelis. As you know, there are far, far many more Chinese. We used to be far less. There were only 3 million Israelis when I was growing up. And there was a wonderful joke told in Israel back then. That was before the relations were established, about an Israeli who meets a Chinese. And the Chinese asked the Israeli, "How many people are you in Israel?" So the Israeli says proudly, "We are now already 3 million people." So the Chinese looks at him, smiles and says, and in which hotel do you reside? And the idea of the joke was, of course, that, you know, in the end, 9 million Israelis is 1/4 of the residents of Beijing, more or less. So we always have to have these proportions in mind. Why, nevertheless, this intensive and broad interest by Chinese in Jewish culture and Israeli culture? I would say something, I hope it doesn't sound as self-congratulatory when I say it. But while the Jewish people are a very small nation, their contribution to humanity was, in a sense, disproportionate. You know, 1 in 400 people in the world is a Jew. 1 in 4 who won a Nobel Prize in the sciences is a Jew. So this is quite remarkable. Tel Aviv, our great city, happens to be the place with the largest concentration in the world of startups. So I think the interest comes in part because of that. And when I meet with delegations from China of high-tech professionals and professors and business people, often the question they are most interested in learning more about is, what is it about Jewish culture? What is it about Israeli culture that encourages innovation to such an extent? And I have a very structured lecture about this, however, not one that I will share with you today, because it requires some time. But it's an interesting question to discuss. What is it about this culture that encourages so much innovation? And I think it's one of the potential contributions of our mutual dialogue that we can share the answer with our Chinese colleagues, and that we can learn, of course, a lot from them about that very same question and learn other things. So it's a wonderful thing that we have this cooperation. And I hope it continues. I hope it intensifies. I hope that the pandemic would soon be over and we can actually meet, something we didn't have the opportunity necessarily to do so far. So I hope we can soon meet. We can soon have students from China at our university learning Jewish studies, Israeli studies, Hebrew, and other things that we are happy to share with international students. I hope all of this happens very soon. And again, I'm very happy and thankful for the cooperation we have. And thank you so much, Yude, again, for everything you've done. I hope to meet again very soon.
Thank you very much, Professor Shanwei, for your wonderful closing remark, and also for your cooperation in organizing this forum. As you mentioned, we should also pay thanks to Yan Yan and Kao for their hard work to prepare for this forum. At last, I would like to repeat my thanks to all of the participants, all of the distinguished scholars in China and Israel, and all of the participants. And some of them we don't know, and we can't see you, but I would like to say my thanks to all of you. So maybe it's time for us to say goodbye. I hope someday, maybe in the second half of this year, we can meet somewhere in Shandong or in Weihai or in some other area to have to meet physically, as the ambassador mentioned in the beginning. Okay, some time for us to say goodbye. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
谢谢大家。